Hello and welcome back. It's that time of the year when I usually start doing more rate the artist ranking videos, stuff that's a little bit more low effort because, the effort's going to other places. But today we have a very special ranking the artist because we're talking about one of the most iconic groups of the 70s, Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin to me are one of those bands like the Rolling Stones or Pink Floyd or the Beatles where you may like them, you may dislike them, but they are undeniable. I myself would never call myself a huge Led Zeppelin fan, but I own in some form or fashion every album and know every album pretty well. They're one of those bands I have a lot of nostalgic affection for because my dad is a big Led Zeppelin fan and thus I heard all these albums growing up, and so I think I'm reasonably well equipped to rate all of the Led Zeppelin albums. Studio albums. We're not doing live albums. We're not doing compilations other than Coda, which we're throwing in there just because. So, yeah. So beginning the countdown, the worst Led Zeppelin album is Coda. 1982, it's a slapdash collection of leftovers thrown out there after the tragic alcohol-related death of John Bonham. And it has a couple of really strong cuts on it, but it's not an album I turn on a lot, and that's because it doesn't hold together as an album, It's just basically an outtakes compilation, and Led Zeppelin really didn't have that many outtakes. They threw most of the choice stuff they had left onto Physical Graffiti. And so this really is, it's not even sloppy seconds, it's more like sloppy thirds. So the next worst Led Zeppelin album is Presence. I know it's a fan favorite, I know it has a lot of their most iconic tracks on it. It's a favorite of mine too. Like the first side of Presence is pretty much flawless. Achilles' Last Stand, For Your Life, the Royal Orleans, Nobody's Fault But Mine, that's on side 2. But those are all phenomenal tracks, easily some of the best stuff they did. But then you get to side 2 and things slow down a bit and it's not as good. This is where the drugs and the alcohol really started to bring him down. Bonham and Page were hitting the sauce pretty hard. Robert Plant had been in a terrible car accident around that time, so his voice is not in peak form. John Paul Jones is John Paul Jones. That's kind of true of every Led Zeppelin album. And it's not like side 2 is bad necessarily so much as it is a lot of the stuff on side 2 is just kind of blah. And that's not something you can usually say for Led Zeppelin. It's a good album. Aside from Coda, they're all good. But this is probably the one I reach for the least in terms of listening to it in full. If we were ranking it on some of the tracks on here, this would be one of the ones I'd listen to the most. Achilles' Last Stand and For Your Life in particular have always been personal favorites of mine. But as an entire album, I have to put it down a little lower because of all that stuff on side 2 that I don't really remember when the album is not on. Okay, so aside from Coda and Presence, the discography is very, very even. And this is a perfect example of this because you have two albums that I like about the same amount at the beginning and the end of their career. And it was very hard for me to figure out which one I liked more. And ultimately, it came down to personal preference. And this is probably a hot take. I don't imagine this is most people's opinion. Led Zeppelin 1, This is, I put this third from the bottom, not because it's a bad album, it's actually a very, very good album, but because this, to me, it's the only album they did that clearly belongs in the 60s. And it's, there are some really great tracks on here, and the whole album is worth your time, it's worth a listen, but it's all 60s rootsy, bluesy British music, It's the only album that they did that I could see someone who really got into that Yardbirds, Eric Clapton, John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, Cream before they went psychedelic, that kind of British blues, Clapton is God type of music fan. this is the only album Led Zeppelin did that I could see somebody like that really, really getting into. And me, I'm not as big a fan of that stuff. I love some blues, but I love, you know, I love the American blues. I like, you know, I love the source, you know, the Delta stuff, the Piedmont blues, you know, the hill country stuff. And this is, you know, this and a lot of the British stuff is it's not as good to my ears, even though this is a very good album. The stuff on here that is not sort of 60s Brit blues boom stuff, you know, like Good Times, Bad Times, Dazed and Confused, Communications Breakdown, that stuff is phenomenal, but I wish there was more on here like it, and this is why it's as low as it is. But that being said, it's still a phenomenal album. The next album on the list, and this is where I said, you know, this could be controversial, In Through the Outdoor. This album, this was the last one they put out together. It's an odd album in the sense that it's the sound of a band kind of caught in transition. The thing about Bonham's death is that it meant that Led Zeppelin didn't really fade away, and they didn't really burn out the way a lot of their peers did in the 80s. They just kind of stopped. And so this album sort of catches them with one foot in the old traditional Led Zeppelin sound and the next foot in something that we never really got. You have some really interesting stuff on here. You have In the Evening, you have the Gizmotron, devised by Godley and Cream, formerly of 10cc, in play on Page's guitar on that track. You have Fool in the Rain, one of the best sort of pop songs Led Zeppelin ever did. You have All of My Love, a fantastic sort of melodramatic plant thing. Even though I say melodramatic, it's actually quite heartfelt because it's about the death of his very, very young son. And you have probably the best thing on the album, definitely the most interesting, Carouselambra, which is this 10-plus minute John Paul Jones dance thing that is just, it's not disco, it's not quite Led Zeppelin doing disco, but it's Led Zeppelin doing a dance track, and a dance track that goes on for over 10 minutes. It's really interesting. The synthesizers used really interestingly. I like how it shifts in the middle into something completely different. It almost reminds me, in a very loose, very sloppy way, it reminds me of some of Funkadelic's longer stuff, like One Nation Under a Groove, or Not Just Knee Deep, you know, that kind of thing, even though it's not really that funky. And that's a weird comparison to make. It reminds me a little bit of that. It's a fairly strong album to go out on, I have to say. You know, some people don't like it, but I've always had a lot of affection for this one. So yeah, it's interesting. There's some stuff on here I'm not crazy about, same as with the previous couple albums, but the best stuff on here is phenomenal, and that's ultimately why I put it above Led Zeppelin I. So the next album in my ranking of these albums is Led Zeppelin II. This is the album that really codified their sound. It's the album that debatably really codified hard rock. It's only as low as it is on the list because there are some albums of theirs that I like a lot more. This is an all-time classic. Many people would probably put this as number one. In fact, I was surprised it wound up as low as it was. And that's primarily because even though I love a lot of these songs, and this album, this one and Led Zeppelin IV play like a greatest hits. You know, you listen to this album, you listen to like half of classic rock radio. But it's not one I turn on as much as some of the other ones higher on this list. But like I said, the tracks are classic, you know, Whole Lot of Love, What Is and Should Never Be, Heartbreaker, Ramble On, Moby Dick, you know, even the Lemon Song and Thank You, you know, all of, you know, it's all classic stuff. It's a very, very strong album. And because of that, there's not a whole lot to say about that. So the next album on my list, I actually thought this was going to be higher. I thought this was going to be like top 3. And if I had made this video like 5 years ago, it probably would have been top 3. Led Zeppelin III. But it's in the top 4, you know. Led Zeppelin III. This is their kind of branching out album. It's folksier, rootsier, but in a different way than the original album. This is where they're touching a little bit more on that British folk sound. They're dabbling in a lot of stuff. It has one of their last great sort of bluesy tracks, Since I've Been Loving You. Immigrant Song continues that vein from Led Zeppelin II. Celebration Day is great. Tangerine, Gallows Pole, Hats Off to Roy Harper. Just really, really solid stuff. It's the incline into the Imperial phase. It's shows off where they were going to go in a way more than Led Zeppelin IV does. So yeah. So number 3 is the untitled fourth Led Zeppelin album. Sometimes called Zoso, but usually referred to as Led Zeppelin IV. And yeah, if I said Led Zeppelin II plays like a greatest hits, this one absolutely does. Everything on here is something you've heard on the radio many, many times if you grew up listening to classic rock radio the way I did. Black Dog, Rock and Roll, The Battle of Evermore, which is a really interesting track, probably the deepest cut on there, but still something you've probably heard at least once. You know, Stairway to Heaven, as cliche as it is, as overplayed as Stairway to Heaven is, it still has that little bit of magic and mystery to it. You know, Stairway to Heaven, even though Led Zeppelin are not a band in this genre, it's almost like Baby's first prog track, along with something like Roundabout by Yes. You know, it's simple, but it does the multi-part thing in a clean and accessible way, and it's brilliant in its overplayedness. Frank Zappa did a wonderful cover of it. See, I had to get the Zappa reference in it. One in every video, baby. It ends with, you know, to me, one of the best tracks, maybe the best track they ever did, certainly the best album closer, When the Levee Breaks. Just absolutely phenomenal reworking of an old blues song, but they absolutely made it their own. You know, it's one of the things I love about Led Zeppelin doing the blues is that the problem I have with the British blues boom is that it's all these skinny middle class English guys from like Birmingham and Manchester and London trying to, you know, sing and play their guitars like these basically barely literate tenant farmers in the Mississippi River Delta. And there's something kind of off. There's something that I don't like about that. There's something kind of off, you know. You know, they don't experience the blues the same way someone with that background does. And that's why a lot of the 60s British blues boom just kind of falls short. Led Zeppelin got around that because Led Zeppelin didn't really do authentic blues. They did their own sort of Led Zeppelin rock take on blues. And so I feel like a lot of people I know are probably going to say, well, you're talking out of your ass here, John. But, you know, whatever. Anyway, that's a great track. It's a great album. So my number 2, I had no idea that number 2 was going to be this album. I knew what number 1 was going to be. I knew what number 1 was going to be from the moment I started thinking about making this video a month ago. But I didn't realize that number 2 was going to be Physical Graffiti. Because this, to tell you the truth, this is not an album I know as well as some of the other ones, but I've been listening to it a lot in the last couple weeks, and it has really grown on me in that time, because it is just really a phenomenal album. It's their one double disc. It's probably the pinnacle of their powers as songwriters. It's very much in the White Album tradition of, we're going to give you a double album, so here's everything we've got. You know, there's some funky stuff on here, there's some folky stuff, there's some blues, there's hard rock, there's ballady type stuff. There's prog, basically, just all-out prog tracks. You know, basically everything Led Zeppelin did is on here. This or number 1. Just many, many iconic tracks. Houses of the Holies title track, you know, which didn't make the album. Trampled Underfoot, Kashmir, In My Time of Dying, 10 Years Gone, just incredible, incredible songs. You know, as I said, I hadn't realized until I gave it another listen a couple weeks back just how much good stuff was on this album, because it's not one I really put on all that much. You know, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, I was much more into these guys than I am now. And back then, I never listened to this album. But listening to it again in 2021, it's absolutely phenomenal stuff, and I can't believe I neglected it for so long. So, my number 1 Led Zeppelin album, my favorite album they did, Houses of the Holy. You know, part of it is nostalgia. You know, this is definitely the one that when I was a kid, my dad played the most. This is the one I heard the most. This is the Led Zeppelin album I know the best, by far. But, you know, I have to say, it's still my favorite. It's just a great, great album. You know, Over the Hills and Far Away, the Rain song, even like Dire Maker and the Crunge. A lot of people I know hate those 2 tracks, just despise them. And I get not hating. I get hating Dire Maker. Dire Maker is at least a minute longer than it has to be. But the Crunge is just so goofy. You know, it's so silly and out of place for them to be doing a James Brown pastiche on their 1973 hard rock album. Like I was saying on the last album, there's also some proggy stuff, you know, the Rain song. Even to an extent, the song remains the same, but definitely the Rain song. The Rain song has a lot of very proggy moments on there. A lot of great Mellotron, you know, just really, really great, really, really good stuff. There's The Ocean, you know, that one track, you know, The Ocean, Dancing Days, just really, really strong album, a lot of good stuff. And it's my personal sort of one I reach for. If I'm going to listen to Led Zeppelin, I'm going to reach for Houses of the Holy. That's the album I like the best. It has most of my favorite songs on there, and, you know, at some point you do have to account for nostalgia when you talk about music. You have to, you know, when I was doing this channel, I used to try to be very objective about things, you know, like the number of songs, pound per pound, etc. But increasingly, you know, as I've gone along and done this, I've realized, you know, nostalgia is important, you know, emotional attachment is important, and that's why it's number 1. So yeah, this probably horribly inadequate list, but hopefully I've talked about these albums to some extent. I do want to go back and review a lot of these eventually. I'm not ready for that just yet, but at some point I do want to do that. But until then, you have this Ranking the Artist video, so yeah.